so now there it goes. And Jim, why don't you take it away? And one more comment is we'll take questions. So if you're thinking of things as we go along, like I don't know what he's talking about, or what does that acronym mean, or something like that, feel free to write it into the question section of the webinar interface, and we'll get to those at the end, or on the fly if it's an easy one. I'll try to answer that as we go through this. So Jim, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Doug. Well, welcome everybody to the Midwest and Great Plains Climate and Drought Outlook, and I'm your narrator today. I guess we call her pilot or whatever. So we'll talk about what's going on in the central U.S., and we have a number of partners, as Doug mentions, and we've got it on the slide here, some of the folks that help us out at NOAA and the state climatologists and the regional climate centers, Drought Mitigation Center, and of course the Climate Prediction Center at NOAA. And our next Outlook will be on September 20th with Brian Fuchs of the National Drought Mitigation Center. And you can access all of these online. We usually put them up a day or so after we've done this presentation, or within 24 hours of doing this presentation. And as Doug says, we'll take questions here at the end. So with the logistics out of the way here, we're going to talk about a couple of things, year-to-date conditions, what's going on in July, and focus in a little more on the last 30 days, and then look around the region for the impacts and talk a little bit about El Niño and climate outlooks, and then wrap it up with questions and comments. And so this is a picture of a cornfield in Missouri, which has been especially hard hit by drought this year, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes here, but I don't think you have to be an agronomist to know that that's not what corn should look like at the early part of August. So if we look at year-to-date, nationally, it was the 11th warmest since 1895, and really for the kind of the north-central part of the central region here, it's been near average. So all those states that are in white there are near average on the temperature side for the year-to-date. And then as you move southward, and especially westward, it gets progressively warmer and warmer. And probably the one state in our area that really wins the award for being exceptionally warm is Colorado, which has been their third warmest January through July on record since 1895. So very warm conditions, especially as you move to the southwest. If you look at precipitation for the same time period, most of the eastern part of the U.S. has been average to above average on precipitation. You get into some of the states to the west and southwest there that you start to see the dryness start to crop up, especially Colorado there with the 12th driest January through July on record. And reason we talk about drought in Missouri, while it was very dry in the last 2 to 3 months, they actually came off a very wet winter. So those two things kind of cancel each other out. So year to date, they don't look that bad, but that really masks the short-term drought problems they have there. And it's kind of the same story for Kansas as well. But right now, Colorado in our area is the 12th driest, and then we've got several that are actually above average on the precipitation to date. Look at July temperatures, so focusing in just on the month of July, it was very warm across the United States. In fact, we were almost 2 degrees above normal for the 20th century, but most of that heat was outside of the central region. Again, kind of the southwestern U.S. from Texas through Colorado and Idaho and Washington there. Those are the areas to the west and south of that line are where we saw the real heat this so far in July. And much of the Midwest and High Plains have actually been near average on the overall temperatures. We look at statewide precipitation. If you look at the central region exclusively, kind of a preponderance of dry conditions in the eastern half of the, especially in the Midwest, and then in the High Plains, it's have more of a tendency to be on the wet side. But these numbers kind of mask some smaller areas that have been exceptionally wet or exceptionally dry. So, but this kind of gives you an overall lay of the land, so you can see that, for example, Missouri had its 23rd driest July on record there. So some very dry areas, but we also have some areas that not so bad. And we'll talk more about some of that here in a minute. As far as July events go, some of the significant climate events were, and that kind of affect our region, was the fires, especially the one in Spring Creek in Colorado. We've also had in July some areas, including Illinois and Iowa and Nebraska, that actually had were overall fairly cool, but also had also noteworthy for having below average maximum temperature. So it's a little different story than what we had in May and June, where we had exceptionally hot weather. We actually had stretches of fairly mild conditions in some parts of the Midwest there. So if we zoom in on precipitation in the last 30 days, so this is a little more detailed look of kind of what I hinted at earlier. This is the total precipitation for the 30-day period. So those areas that are in the warmer shades there only have had many places 1 to 2 or 3 inches of precipitation. And then you can see, even though we've got some areas that have been very dry, if there's kind of that bullseye in northern central Illinois and southern Iowa, for example, but then you see some nearby areas that will be in shades of blue and green, indicating that they've gotten much more precipitation. So it's really kind of been a hit and miss pattern across the central region in the last 30 days. And so, and we'll see this show up in the impacts, where we have some people about having impacts because it's too wet, and others have because it's too dry. So that's the actual precipitation. If you look at the departures from normal for that 30-day period, you can kind of still see that there's some areas, especially in Iowa and Missouri and Illinois and up the Mississippi River Valley there, that are especially dry over the last 30-day periods. And then you can see that some general wetness farther west, and then also to the far east there as well. So we got some real wet spots, and especially in parts of Ohio and Kentucky, and even parts of Kansas have been fairly wet for this time of year. So that's the departure from normal. So that's in inches. Another way to look at that is percent of normal. And sometimes, especially out west, summertime precipitation, you be down 2 inches, and that means you're essentially at 10% of average precipitation. So this is another way to look at it. And again, you can see some of the real hot spots and parts of the Midwest there, and then some really wet areas that are 50 to 100% above normal for this 30-day time period here. So again, that same theme of got some very wet areas right next to some very dry areas. So it's a little hard to track some of these impacts. This is the departure from normal precipitation over the last 3 months. Is really so this gives kind of the bigger picture of where the long-term problems are. And you can really see Missouri and eastern Kansas, for example, stand out as being exceptionally dry there. Maybe we've got some areas, large areas that are 3 to 6 inches below normal over the last 3 months. And we even got some areas that there's even a little red spot in northern Missouri that's down about 9 to 12 inches. So some real dry areas there, but there's also some dry spots up in Wisconsin and Michigan, and you see some areas in the Dakotas that are also very dry, as well as Colorado in the far west there. So, and then intermixed with that are some very wet areas as well. So that's the kind of the longer term picture, and we'll see that impact on the U.S. Drought Monitor here in just a minute. So for temperature departures, really the interesting thing is that we came across the last 30 days with fairly mild summer weather in terms of temperatures. Pretty much across the whole central region was running about 2 to 4 degrees below average. And so even the areas that were very dry, it probably helped a little bit the fact that they weren't quite as scorching hot, and so as they were, say, back in May and June. So that provided a little bit of relief, a little bit of balance against the drier conditions. But you can see there's some areas that were warm. Michigan was warmer than normal for this time of year, as was parts of western Colorado. So there were a few warm spots, but overall it was a fairly mild 30-day pattern there. We've had a couple of warm days, but a lot of near to below average temperatures for most days. So this is the current U.S. Drought Monitor across the region, and you can see how some of those precipitation patterns have played out across the regions, especially in Colorado, which has got a lot of extreme to exceptional drought, and especially in the western half of the state. We also see drought problems in eastern Kansas and much of Missouri and into southern Iowa. But we also have a few other areas that are in the either abnormally dry or in moderate drought, so the impacts aren't quite as strong in those areas. But there are some pretty widespread areas in Michigan and Wisconsin and the upper parts of Minnesota and parts of the Dakotas as well. So there are some very dry areas out there that are starting to show up on the Drought Monitor. I'll zoom in here on Missouri, since that's kind of the probably the and some of the toughest conditions right now that we see, at least certainly in the Midwest and across the region. And so we've got some areas there that really have been battling drought probably about 4 to 5 months in some cases in northern Missouri. I know they were even struggling back in June with drought conditions in those areas. And so we've got some parts of the state now that are in D3 and D4. So that's as bad as it gets. And I would say probably for many of those areas, it's probably as bad as it was in the drought of 2012. And you see similar kinds of situations in eastern Kansas. And we'll show some pictures here in just a minute as we get into the impacts. So this is the change in the Drought Monitor in our area since the last month. So those areas that have a yellow or oranges cast to it have gotten worse over the last month. So you can really see where Missouri, Iowa, and Kansas have gotten worse. And then you can see the addition of the drier conditions in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. So we have seen some expansion, and probably the Missouri is probably the one that catches your eye. But there's been some other areas that have also started to see conditions worsen as well. And I would say, just kind of a side note, August is this time of year, the evaporation rates and transpiration rates are typically at their highest. So even mild shortfalls in precipitation can lead to rapid deterioration in drought conditions. And that's kind of what we've seen in some of these areas, that the damage is accelerated in many cases. This is the modeled soil moisture from one set of models that we look at. And you can see here that Missouri is kind of right in the middle of the bullseye there of very low soil moisture amounts of 50 to 100 millimeters below normal for this time of year. And then there's a few spots up in the Dakotas and Minnesota that are also very low as well. These are models and not observations, so sometimes the observations don't always match up with what you see in the models, and these are not run every day. And so this was the last run we could get our hands on, and there has been some rain in some of these areas, so that might help a little bit. So, but there's probably kind of captures the overall pattern of where we're seeing deficits in soil moisture for this time of year. This is the Streamflow for the 7-day Streamflow amounts across the region. And these probably match up pretty well with the U.S. Drought Monitor. We see very low conditions in Colorado, and then eastern Kansas, Missouri, southern Iowa, and parts of Illinois, and even up into Michigan there. So it's another indication of how dry conditions are across the central U.S. right now. Meanwhile, there's other areas that the rivers and streams are running high. In fact, we got some very high levels in parts of Indiana and Ohio and Iowa and other parts of the Dakotas there. So it's not widespread, but there are some areas that are very low and some areas that are very high on stream flow. So we're looking at some of the impacts and big drought concerns, I would say, probably from Colorado all the way through Kansas, Missouri, and Michigan and Iowa. And we'll talk a little bit about hail damage. And probably the other thing you probably have noticed if you've been outside in the last 30 days is the smoke from the western fires has reached the central part of the U.S. and see kind of the hazy sun and the hazy conditions day and night. And so it's pretty widespread across the central U.S. as this satellite picture shows here. So very hazy conditions from that. So going around the region for Colorado, out there we've heard comments about the underperforming monsoon. It's a little late and a little lame right now, so it's they're just not getting much precipitation out of that. And if you're from the southwestern United States, you know that monsoon is a big topic out there because it's produces rain, especially in the late July and August time frame. Some much needed rain, and it's just not showing up yet for the most part. So we're seeing a worsening of drought conditions, especially in the western part of Colorado. But paradoxically, out on the plains there of Colorado, we've seen a very active hail season, especially the larger hail, and then the poor air quality due to the fires in the west here. And so this is a weather station versus hail, and it looks like the weather station came out the worse the wear for that. So it can not only damage crops, but also can affect our weather instruments as well. So that's always a headache there. Missouri, 98% of the state is in some form of drought or abnormally dry conditions. So here's some photos from around the state here. There's Lewis County, which is the northern part. There's a pond there that's you can see is exceptionally low. And then the lower right-hand side there, we've got a corn crop that is pretty much done there. There's not much hope there of getting much yield out of that. And on the left-hand side there's somebody from East Central Missouri that's baling soybeans, trying to salvage it at least for forage, since it's not going to be any useful for actual bean production. So that's kind of the last straw there of trying to get at least something of worth out of a soybean field. So it's pretty dire straits in many parts of Missouri right now. If you go into South Dakota and North Dakota, South Dakota is some areas there that are getting a little worse in terms of the north central and west central part of the state there. Meanwhile, the area around the Black Hills and parts of southeastern South Dakota are getting wetter. And so all this dry weather has been especially tough on the soybeans. And then it's kind of the same story in North Dakota, where there's worsening drought due to the heat and lack of rainfall. And they also noted the air quality issues associated with the western fires there. So here's a soybean field in McHenry County in North Dakota. So you can see there it's pretty bad shape. For Nebraska, it's strangely enough too wet in parts of northern Nebraska. And in fact, it's impacting hay harvest. There's some fields where we've had a lot of trouble getting being able to cut and take off the hay. But there's also drought impacts in the southeastern part of Nebraska, including stress on corn and soybeans. And in Kansas, there's the worsening drought, especially in the eastern part of the state, and that's having impacts on crops and forage, and as well as urban impacts. And in fact, this is from the assistant state climatologist from Kansas, Mary Knapp, shared this picture of trees in town there in Manhattan, Kansas, that are shedding the leaves. So that's one of the drought response from trees from all this dry weather. So you get into Iowa, it's worsening drought in southern Iowa while remaining wet in the northern part of the state. Illinois is actually in pretty good shape right now. There are a few dry areas in the western regions and then a few hot spots around Bloomington and Kankakee. Indiana, bouts of dryness throughout the growing season, but the livestock area has been mostly spared from this. And so I think so that's the story in Indiana, and really that's kind of the story in Illinois too. We had some areas that at one time or another were in dry conditions, but then they've gotten more rain, so it's looking a little better there. For Michigan, the reports there are the lake levels around the Great Lake Michigan and Lake Erie, and really the other lakes as well. They still have very high lake levels. They have had that for some time now. For Michigan in particular, the highly variable rainfall that's had some impact on yields. But maybe the good news is that this dry weather has reduced disease pressure on many of the fruit crops in that region, even though it has led to a reduced size of some of the fruit. So there are some upsides to having drier conditions. And for Ohio, we've had cooler temperatures at night that they think will favor higher yields. And then they've had, again, like Nebraska, some wet weather that's impacted hay production. So spring wheat progress, there's the northern states there, Montana through Minnesota. The wheat harvested is a little bit ahead of schedule for this time of year, and that's probably from some of that warm weather we had, especially in the May-June time frame. If you look at pasture conditions, and in many places it's gone down. It's a little better in Nebraska, but it's gotten much worse in Missouri. So Missouri and Kansas are really outstanding as far as poor or reduction in the percent of good to excellent, and all those are moving into the poor category. So it looks pretty good in the northern parts of the states and okay in the central parts, but Missouri is probably the really problematic there. If you look at corn production, percent good to excellent, it's really in the green, so that means it's really good shape in much of the Midwest and throughout the Corn Belt there. The only downside there is a little bit in Kansas and especially in Missouri, where only 26% is good to excellent. So it'd be interesting to see where that is, because if you look at the Drought Monitor map, it doesn't even look like it should be that good. Corn progress is actually ahead of schedule. Many parts of the Midwest are between 5 to 10 to 20% ahead of schedule for the percent that's dented at this point. And I think some of the warm conditions in May and June have accelerated the development of corn and soybeans, but then it's kind of eased up a little bit in the last 30 days or so. Same story with soybean conditions. They actually look pretty good at this point, except for Missouri and Kansas, but the rest of the central region is looking pretty good. And then we'll get to the outlooks here. So in the short term, we'll look at El Niño and also drought outlooks and the summer and fall conditions here. So this is the qualitative precipitation forecast for the next 7 days. And there's a band of precipitation basically from Iowa all the way up through Wisconsin, through the Great Lakes, and then another track from the storms through Oklahoma and the kind of the southern and eastern edges of our region of interest right now. So Kentucky looks like they're going to get some pretty good rains, but you can see there's a big hole there right in Missouri where it's been some of the driest conditions there. So they're at least likely to see sizable rains in the next 7 days. If you look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, they've got this large area of increased chance of below normal temperatures extending from the Dakotas down through Kansas, Missouri, and points southward there. So the kind of the western half of the central region there has got a chance for continuation of these cooler temperatures. If you move eastward around the Great Lakes region, they have an increased chance of being on the warm side. And if you look on the right-hand panel on precipitation, they got that large band of increased chance of above-average precipitation from really kind of from the dry area eastward. So maybe that's some good news farther down the road for those guys, and then near normal conditions out on the high plains there. So that's the 8 to 14 day forecast. The longer-term outlooks are probably the primary driver right now is El Niño and the trends that we've been seeing in the last 10 to 15 years. Those are probably the two big factors that are going into these forecasts. So El Niño is likely to be here by this fall. There's about a 60% chance and about a 70% chance by this winter. So if you look at the bar graph there, you can see the probabilities are just keep increasing there as they go into the fall and max out in that November, December, January timeframe, which is kind of the typical life cycle, and then it starts to fade a little bit as you go farther out. So that's probably going to be the main player as we move into fall and winter. So for the September outlook, they have large parts of the central region. In fact, pretty much all of the central region has what they call EC, which is equal chances of above, below, and near normal temperatures, and same thing for precipitation. So there's really not a whole lot there's not any real climate factors that are pushing the odds one way or the other across much of the central U.S. The exception is the Southwest there, where they do have increased chances of being above average on both temperatures and precipitation. So we talked a little bit about the monsoon. This kind of makes it look like maybe they haven't lost hope yet on the monsoon out there. So that might provide some relief for Colorado and surrounding states. We get into the September, October, November outlook. Then we've got really pretty much the whole country painted with an increased chance of above normal temperatures, and most of the U.S. or the central U.S. with equal chances of above, below, and near normal precipitation. So again, you see that area of increased chance of above normal precipitation in the Southwest. They're still maintaining that, but for the rest of us, it's kind of a coin toss of how that's going to play out on precipitation-wise. If you look at the drought outlook for the next 3 months, they've got parts of the area in Missouri and Kansas. They show it as labeled as either the kind of the grayish area there is drought remains, but it's improving, and then the kind of the olive drab or something there is the drought removal likely. I think some of this is probably just climatological as you get into fall. The evapotranspiration demands typically go down, especially once you get the crops out and the leaves fall off the trees. So historically, you have a better chance of drought recovery in the fall, especially you get into late fall with the cooler temperatures and the pretty much the end of the growing season. And then you go farther west into Colorado. There, they do show that there's some areas there where they think the drought will persist. And then for the rest of the parts of the central region, Michigan, the Dakotas, and parts of Minnesota, there, they've got us for the most part drought persisting up there. So maybe not so much relief in that area, but it'll be interesting to see how that Missouri-Kansas thing plays out because they really don't have that area being wet this fall. So that kind of makes it tougher to make any kind of recovery at this point. So we get into December, January, February. They've got pretty much the northern half or 2/3 of the U.S. with an increased chance of above average temperatures. So pretty much all of the central region has this increased chance of above average temperatures. And then equal chances once you get south of Missouri and so forth. On the right-hand panel, on the precipitation side, they got wet conditions from the southwest to the southeast, an increased chance of above average precipitation. And then they've got this area of below average precipitation, kind of centered on Montana there, and the rest of us are in what they call equal chances there. So that's the story for this winter. Kind of a fairly mild El Niño pattern at this point, but we'll see how that plays out. So kind of in summary, we've had some cooler temperatures in the last 30 days, near to below average temperatures. So that's been helpful for agriculture, especially in the areas that have been on the dry side. Probably not so much in the areas that have been getting a lot of rain. I'd say probably my biggest concern right now is the drought, especially in the western parts of the region. Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, and southern Iowa are particularly bad. But on the other side of the coin, we've got El Nino coming up, and we got fall just around the corner. Not much to say about September for us. Most of the areas and equal chances on temperature and precipitation. The September through November timeframe, though, it does have an increased chance of the above normal temperatures and an increased chance of above normal rainfall or precipitation in the Colorado region. So that's here's some additional information on the partners here, and let's see. So we'll leave, and then there's some questions. We've got a couple people on the phone today that we can field questions, and then there's also available offline if you want to follow up later. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Doug.
All right. Well, thanks, Jim, and thank you very much for the presentation. If you would back up just a couple slides to the December through February maps.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you did mention that these are typical patterns you might that an El Nino winter would suggest. I just want to sort of reiterate that is the thinking. And the probability is strongest for moving into an El Nino situation in terms of the equatorial Pacific, and this is sort of a classic pattern across the United States that you might expect looking this far out. This will be adjusted as we get closer to this time frame. Of course, every month is going to change slightly. And I just want you to note that the areas to the north tend to be warmer than normal. And there is a tendency, especially in Montana and places like that, for being better chances of being drier than normal. We may also see that materialize in the Ohio Basin as well. But again, that's something that the forecasters will look at as we move closer and closer to the winter time. I also wanted to say, because I know we have a number of people on here sort of interested in this, is I know we have Kevin Grody, but I think, Kevin, your phone isn't, you didn't enter the code, so I'm just going to have to speak a little bit for you, because I know a number of people are sort of interested in the Corps' outlook for the Missouri River, and I'll just quickly highlight what if my computer behaves, quickly sort of reiterate what they've said. Higher than average releases from their system projects in the Missouri Basin. They're going to continue to release water at something around 58,000 cubic feet per second for the remainder of the navigation season to ensure evacuation of stored waters in the reservoirs to the north. This is one of the higher runoff years for the Missouri Basin as well. And let's see, Jim? Is that you?
No.
Oh, Dennis, mute yourself. The 2018 runoff forecast in the Missouri River Basin above Sioux City is 39.8 million acre feet, which is 157% of average according to the Corps. July runoff was 5.1 million acre feet, and you really got to know the river to appreciate these numbers, but that's about 155% of normal. So I wanted to mention that, and the last thing is that there are numerous, if people are interested, because I got a question or two about impacts, numerous places to go to find impacts in terms of agricultural impacts as well as what are happening to municipalities and such. In Missouri specifically, just to let you all know, Missouri is sort of in the state does weekly drought assessment, meetings, and they are bringing a lot of experts to talk about what can be done about it and all that kind of business. So whenever you have D3 or whenever you see D3 or D4 drought on a map, on the drought monitor anyway, those are serious 1 in 50 to 100 year or worse conditions, and so that's as bad as it gets in terms of drought. So just want to let you all know that crops and people and livestock and everything else involved, ecosystems, really suffer during those times. So anyway, I'll go down the list, but I'll go to Dennis Toddy from the USDA Climate Ag Hub. Do you have anything you'd like to add in before we get to the questions?
Yeah, per the impact, I mean, the impact ones, obviously crops have been, if the, Jim showed the crop reports on some of the issues there. Feed has been a real issue for livestock. There have been limited water for livestock. Those are using ponds. And then we've even had now Kansas and Missouri, we've been hearing issues with municipalities having limited water available in some rural water systems, and some livestock producers being cut off from using rural water for their livestock. So those have been the biggest impact issues we've been seeing there, and that's mainly Missouri, some Kansas, and some into far southern Iowa.
Yeah, we can't go through all the impacts, and that's for every state. And just suffice to say, the impacts generally are on a kind of curve is that exponential curve as you get as the D level of severity, drought level of severity gets worse in any particular place. A couple questions here. Why aren't the dry parts of Iowa, Illinois, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Michigan depicted in a worse category on the USDM like Missouri? And the simple answer to that is because it hasn't been generally it hasn't been as dry, and we haven't seen as severe of impacts as we certainly have in eastern Kansas and Missouri and southern Iowa. That's why. And that's why those different categories even exist. And as you go up in D level from 0 to 4, the frequency also is much different. So like I mentioned earlier, the D4 level is reserved for 1 in 50 to 1 in 100 year events. It means that there's a 1 to 2% chance per year of that happening in any particular location. And then lesser amounts for other D levels. And then the other question was, what have been reported for impacts in these states? And I tried to show a place to go to look at some of those. I see that I'll send out another one here in a minute. There's another suggestion on where to go look for impacts across the board. It's not just ag impacts from any particular community. And okay, another question was, is the large amount of patchiness, and actually let's go to the drought monitor maps if you can do that, Jim.
Okay.
And the question, I guess, to you, and you can try and answer this, is a good one. Is a large amount of patchiness on the drought in the wet areas typical, or is this relatively rare? I think the point is here, or what's being suggested here, is that, especially if you look in Texas, there's a bunch of points that are kind of red and D3, D4, and then a lot of other areas that are not. And then of course, even looking here, you see some yellows and just, if you will, patchiness. And the short answer, I think, again, is that for whatever reason, these areas have missed a lot of rainfall, whereas places in Nebraska, especially northern Nebraska into northern Iowa, southern Minnesota, have really gotten hit. And now why the pattern is that way, I'm sure there is an answer, but I don't feel comfortable enough to tell you exactly why that is. Often drought does sort of can build upon itself. This year is a little bit different than that in some cases. Certainly in the Southwest, that happens with some frequency. Dennis or Jim, anything you want to follow that up with?
The one thing that has been persistent this year has been the area of Kansas and Missouri, extending even back to last winter, that they've really not had many storm systems that have come through and produced precipitation. That's why the drought has been so bad there. If you look just north of that, at that area from Nebraska into northern Iowa, and then on over into the eastern Corn Belt, has had several more storm systems, and showed, when Jim showed the precipitation totals, they were, wetter, shorter period of time and longer period of time throughout the year. So, and then, yeah, Doug is right that there is this, when you get some systems or a few storms, that can alleviate conditions a little bit in certain areas, while certain areas don't get that rainfall. So yeah, here's the 3-month one. The comment we heard yesterday was Nebraska is green, and southeast South Dakota, and northern Iowa, northern Illinois, but then that area from southern Iowa down into Missouri has not received rainfall of much substance anyway.
Yeah, and there are other issues with some parts of northern Missouri in terms of soils and just the ability of that land surface to soak up the moisture, as well as maybe other soils and things like that. But that's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit for this call. Here's another question: do the smoke from the fires impact hail or other weather factors? And the answer to that is I have absolutely no idea on hail. It obviously provides a lot of nuclei out there to form droplets and things on, but I'm not aware of smoke helping or hurting hail. Anybody?
Not that I'm aware of either. Really, the only impact I've seen from the smoke, other than the air quality issues, which of course is very important, there was some discussion about it reducing solar radiation that reaches the surface, and so that might have some impacts on crops, especially in areas that have a short growing season. So, for example, North Dakota is where we discussed that offline as being a potential downside from the smoke, is that reduced solar radiation, so you get reduced photosynthesis, and so then you reduce your yields. But yeah, it's a little hard to tell with all the other things going on as well.
Right. Another question was, is the information submitted on this site? And I provided everybody the site, the Drought Impact Reporter site, which is housed at the National Drought Mitigation Center. Anyway, I threw that out there in case people wanted to look up impacts in their particular region that are being reported. Those aren't all of them, by the way, but that's a number of them. Anyway, the question was, is this information submitted on the site used for the Drought Monitor? And the answer is yes. It is taken into account. In fact, it's pushed by the drought community to any and everybody who is interested in relaying the impacts either on their backyard or farm or county, whatever, state, whatever. And then, and like I said, there is another site. Let me see if I can copy this reasonably. Another site that you might look at that maybe is a little more friendly. Let's see if I can put that in there. There we go. And I'm going to send this to all. And this is another place to go, also at the University of Nebraska, I think, that at the National Drought Mitigation Center, I think, that can show where it's a GIS tool to view reports, and all the new Missouri data will be there too, according to Molly. Thank you, Molly. Looking for anything else? Anybody has any questions, or if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, you can certainly do that as well. Any other questions or comments? We didn't get too much into fires. We mentioned fires earlier in the season in Colorado and the severity of that. There have been fires very lately in Montana up around Glacier that have destroyed some buildings and obviously lots of trees. I don't think those are immense fires like they are in California, at least yet. That's a good thing. Yeah, so I don't know. Anything else? Anybody? Does anybody want to talk? Oh, I will say one more thing. Later this year, I think in October we have it scheduled, we'll be talking more about how the year shapes up, and like we do every year, how the year shapes up in terms of the growing season. In other words, we'll have a guest presenter along with our normal presenter just talking about impacts for the growing season for the region in terms of different crops and things like that. So obviously that person's from the USDA. He's been on these calls before, Brad Rippey, and has a lot of information to share with us. So we appreciate your help, or appreciate your attendance, and Jim's help and Dennis's help in putting these together. So thank you guys very much. I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think we can end it a little bit early. Our next call will be, I think, what was it, September 20th with Brian Fuchs?
That's right.
Yep. Yeah, Brian Fuchs from the National Drought Mitigation Center out of Lincoln, Nebraska will give us an update on all of this stuff, not just drought. So thank you all. And see you next month.